all the candy that's spilling out, right?
Well, there's the promise of candy that somehow by running down this other position and these other hypothetical people that you're going to benefit. But it's almost like a piñata that never opens. So when we have political discussions, we can ask, what does winning look like in a political discussion? How do we win talking politics? And I'll throw out a common misconception or a common opinion is that winning a political conversation is a debate and you have to convince the other person that you are correct and that they were in fact wrong. How often does that seem like our expectations around a political conversation?
That seems like the natural starting point, right? When you go into a political conversation, the assumption is there's one side that has a handle on the truth and the other doesn't, and you don't know up front going into the conversation how things are going to, like, where basically the whole point of the conversation is to figure that out. And I think there's sort of a cultural reason for this. If you think about the way our education system is organized, any sort of communication, writing, or verbalized communication, it centers around having to stake out a position, a perspective on something, and the extent to which you're able to nimbly and comprehensively defend that position against alternative points of view, that is an indication of one's understanding or mastery of that subject, or expertise in that subject. And I think it just naturally carries over into how we walk into a political dialogue or a political conversation. And I think what we're advancing...
It's almost like debate club in high school, like where you're assigned a position and it's adversarial right from the get-go, and someone has to be a winner, right, who's made the bigger point.
It also seems that there's more at stake than just the two people involved in the conversation. It's like you're a representative, you're a stand-in for that belief system, for that tribe, for that group that you belong to. You're self-conscious of the group whose viewpoints you're representing, whether you're conservative or liberal. So you feel like there's a lot at stake, that you're either going to give up ground or gain ground for your cause. And I think that sense of there being a sort of intellectual battle or sort of Manichaean dualism of good versus evil, that sense of a struggle adds a lot more of an adversarial quality to this. And so the natural starting point, I think, for political conversations, if you just were to ask somebody without giving a lot of thought, hey, what does winning look like in politics? It has to do with one side being predominant and being able to affect their policy vision or being able to shape the world in a way that would lead to however the good outcome is defined. Maybe for conservatives, it's a return to a more traditional type of world about having a certain level of respect for one's roles and responsibility in the world. Whereas if one is more left-leaning or liberal, it's more so about having a more egalitarian vision, right? More equitable vision.
Right. And so we seem to fall into what we see on debate stages, right? Where there are two candidates representing each party, and they're barely ever going to agree. They're not set up to agree. The whole point of a debate is to score a win for your side. And so as citizens, we can fall into this trap that we've kind of set for ourselves as a society, that every conversation about anything to do with political policy has to be a debate, and we're going to mirror a debate right there in our daily lives. The problem with that is neither of us is running as candidates for anything. And so what winning would look like is probably you've alienated somebody by constantly running down their values, their side of an argument to try to have your side be elevated. One of the problems from social psychology that we've observed, it's called idea inoculation, which is this notion that if you attempt to convince someone of something that they don't currently believe, a one single conversation is unlikely to do it, and so they actually get hardened against the position you advocated for because they feel like they've weathered some storm, they survived it, and they're still holding their beliefs. So it's called idea inoculation. You've almost guaranteed that the person is going to agree with you less, and they're probably going to like you a whole lot less and not want to say hello to you the next time you find yourselves at a gathering together. So that's one, the debate framework. It may feel like you've won, but you've probably lost. Another common outcome when we discuss politics is that we find, by God, we agree on a lot. So there's nothing really to convince you of. So let's just go ahead and talk about how much the other side doesn't get it and run down a bunch of anonymous people who aren't in the room right now and bond over the fact that we can't stand these fellow citizens. Is that winning?
And then what you end up getting there is just more alienation, basically. You're just shrinking the number of individuals who you would consider to be potential collaborators or potential friends. I mean, family relationships can get severed by political disagreements. So there's a lot of stakes on it.
You're arguing against a straw man. There's no one to defend the other side. So you're probably going to gravitate toward hyperbole and filling in what the opposition would be from the standpoint of extreme confirmation bias, that you're both correct. Now you're getting social approval that you're correct, and you're kind of both, getting this notion that you're of the same mind about something, and that some anonymous people somewhere, no one specific, is at odds with this, and that's not healthy in any way to anticipate what the opposition would say and assign them a position they probably don't hold. That's an extreme version of the alternative concept. So in that case, you may bond, but you're kind of bonding over something undesirable, which is kind of running down other people, and that doesn't feel great, really, in the end. So we would submit that that's not winning either.
If you really think about what political conversations are akin to, actually, just a random memory here. So my daughter just went to a friend's birthday party, and they had a little pinata thing set up, right? And political conversations can really feel like sort of like a pinata exercise in a way, whether there's mutual animosity for the same target. So you're both just whacking at this thing, and there's a sort of feel-good element to this. There's a sort of dopamine drip, all the candy that's spilling out, right?
Well, there's the promise of candy that somehow by running down this other position and these other hypothetical people that you're going to benefit. But it's almost like a piñata that never opens. You're just wailing away at this thing until you both get tired.
Yeah, you're right. It is kind of an illusion, because at the end of it, you've gained nothing, right? If more often than not, you can measure losses, right? The loss of an opportunity to gain a new perspective, have a different, maybe a more challenging way of questioning what your assumptions were coming into it. So you've really kind of lost an opportunity for growth, right? So winning in a political conversation should be about learning. You're gaining something that you didn't walk into the conversation having. And what we'd submit is it's a golden opportunity when you encounter somebody who thinks very differently from you, because now you are dealing with somebody who's tuned to the world in a very different way. They're going to notice things you don't notice. They're going to be sensitive to things that you're not sensitive to. So together, it's like you have a broader spectrum of events and things that you can both detect. But the problem is it winds up being a battle over whose world is the mirage, right? And in a way, it's almost like, imagine if a snake had an argument with a bee. So a snake's tuned to infrared and the bee's tuned to ultraviolet. And they're both arguing with the other world, the other animal's world is a hallucination. It doesn't exist because it can't see it, right?
Yeah, you can't see into someone else's head. And to put on our neuroscience lab coats for a moment, one of the things that you mentioned there that's quite important is the opportunity to learn. Mm-hmm. So when someone has a differing viewpoint, that's a learning opportunity. And a lot of what the brain does is predict things. So that we have something in mind, we call it a schema or a script for how an issue should play out, how we see the world. And if someone parrots that same idea back at us, our brain says, yep, that's right. and it hardens that belief a little bit more. You get some social proof that seems to be the case. No learning has occurred, and that's not actually a very high activation state for the brain. What really activates the brain, what engages brain networks in the frontal lobes and in the cerebellum, is the violation of expectations. It's when you have a prediction, let's just throw out like gun control. You're either for gun control or very much against it. Those are the only two positions. Okay, this person's for it. They're not a gun owner. Great, I know the script in my head. But then they say, but I have shot firearms, and it's really interesting the different properties of them. Well, wait a minute. That's an opportunity to learn. Wait, this person advocates for gun control, but they know about guns? Okay, now there's something to talk about. There's an invitation. The brain becomes very active. These prediction error signals go off in our heads, and that's the brain's opportunity to learn. So that's what a conversation can gravitate toward, if you see it as a learning opportunity, that's quite a different tone to take, and a different posture follows.
This introduces a clear tactic that one could deliberately employ in the midst of a conversation where one appears to lack curiosity, and that is to try and determine or estimate what would be the most surprising thing that I could reveal to this person about myself, a belief that I shouldn't have based on wherever stereotypes could be ascribed to oneself. But what you're showing this person is you're more than just the label that they're going to ascribe to you. What really dulls curiosity is the sense that we already have a handle on identifying what something is. Like, there's no sense in spinning our wheels thinking about something that we feel we already fully understand. So when somebody is identified, tagged in one's mind or coded in one's mind as being a liberal or a conservative, it gives the impression that there's nothing more to learn about them, nothing surprising about them. You just tick all the boxes and say, yes, well, they think this about guns, about climate, etc. But if you trot out something that seems to kind of go against that schema or that model that they have in their mind of what that person should believe, that piques curiosity. That's what the human mind really craves, is that error signal of, whoa, I didn't see that coming. That's very surprising. Tell me a little bit more.
Right, and it naturally stokes up your sense of attention. Your focused attention follows when your brain confronts that, oh wow, here's a bit of evidence that we didn't see coming. Time to update the whole script in our heads. And so a chance to update can be really a very helpful thing, and it really does drive forward a conversation. Now you've got something to talk about. If somebody says something surprising, it makes you curious naturally, and you want to know more, and people love to talk about their own opinion. And so that you can leverage that, not just to, unveil your true opinion and just it's a monologue, but rather, ask someone questions, follow that curiosity, and don't interrupt, and try to surprise them as well. Like, you kind of a really great dialogue, a stimulating conversation has to have what's going to happen next. Like, you almost step out a little bit into discomfort, and if you feel that, you're doing it right. You're going to elicit some interesting new perspective, and that's what we're all here for. That's part of the goal.
You're pointing out there's really an aesthetic quality to all of this. A really good dialogue, a good conversation has this element of almost being like a good plot for a story or for a movie or for a book, right? Where you don't want it to just be the same tired old model of what you're expecting. Oh, okay, so you think this about guns. I think this about guns. We go back and forth arguing about your sources and my sources. It's a tired story, and we know how that goes. In fact, you can just say up front, look, a good way to start a conversation in order to actually set up this goal of exploration is to say, look, you know what? It's most likely going to be the case that you're not going to convince me to think this about this candidate or about guns or whatever it might be. I'm not going to convince you. And it's not because either one of us is dull-witted or incapable of reasoning. We have our convictions.
And also, we don't have to convince each other, because
exactly.
neither of us is running for office.
Right, exactly. There's no real high stakes in all of this. So what are the things we can talk about? Well, how about this? Where do those views come from? Sometimes it's not even transparent to ourselves. That in itself could be a very interesting exercise. Like, you look at the genealogy of your own belief system and you actually ask yourself, like, why do I feel this way? And it might be surprising as you're really looking inward, right? But with the assistance of somebody else's perspective, their own made their own unique story for how they came to the complete opposite position on the topic. And instead of it being an adversarial type of interaction, it's a mutual adventure in trying to learn something about yourself, about your own history, about your own assumptions, the things that are important to you in this world. You realize, oh, I guess the values I have here when it comes to, say, security or self-direction, whatever it might be that's driving my belief system, it appears these are like major bedrock principles that are configuring the way I'm viewing the world. You can really get a sense on the fundamental ways in which you're interfacing with the world around you.
Yeah, so an example is I was born in New York State, a traditional blue state, if ever there was. I was not raised owning guns. I didn't fire guns as a kid. I then lived in California. If that's the premise, you think, yeah, it's a typical liberal blue state gun control, person, and
I'm from
maybe.
Texas.
But I would surprise you by saying, well, what's interesting about guns is firing a rifle is very different than firing a black powder musket. And I've done both, and it's not unlike the difference between a compound bow
and a recurve bow.
The accuracy, is higher in one case than with another, and it's sort of like a primitive weapon and a modern weapon, and it's like, whoa, So we can talk about shooting. That's an interesting avenue into this. Let's, rather than just assume he's pro-gun control, one of those people, let's actually talk about this, because there's something there it's stimulating, it's surprising. Where do we go next? And you can play that game of sort of mutually surprising one another with interesting facts, and it makes the conversation go a whole lot better, and you really start to learn about the other person and see them as a unique individual who has a set of values, as we all do.
That's right. And there's also a bit of compassion that we should throw into this as to why this happens in the first place. We all lead very busy lives. The world's impossibly complex. And so the mind takes shortcuts. They're called heuristics. So in cognitive psychology, the science of understanding thinking, the processes in the mind that enable us to attend and pay attention to things in the world, remember things, and so on and so forth. We have these little mental shortcuts that we use in order to quickly ascertain something about a situation that's really complicated. So human beings, perhaps the most complicated things you can encounter. And so in order to quickly identify important features about a person, we look for clues that we think are sort of like as soon as you know this one fact, this one little note about them, you know everything else that can branch out about that individual, right? As soon as somebody says, like in my case, hey, I'm from Texas, he says he's from New York, you immediately start coming to conclusions. And all of our minds work this way. It's just erroneous, it's a mistake for us to think, oh, this group of people, their minds behave this way, but this group of people, they're reasonable, their minds don't work this way. We're all kind of in that same position.
Right, it's the script playing out in your head, right? So whenever you feel like you're on autopilot, and your brain is a great categorization engine. We just put things into categories to make sense of the world. But heuristics are, they're fine some of the time, but we can over-apply heuristics. So much of the heuristics research points out the flaws in our heuristics where we're over-applying some category judgment. And this is a very bad idea with other people because people are complex and the world's complex. And so our role as citizens and as participants in any kind of discussion, any good discussion, is actually to check ourselves, to put the brakes on when we feel those judgments coming to the surface about some, the state someone's from or someone's background. It's sort of like, let's pump the brakes here and dig a little deeper and ask some questions and start to get the lay of the land, and then you can start to have more of a bonding experience. And when you can feel it when you start to bond over things, and now you're sharing more of an authentic opinion, a true opinion. And if you want to get into political positions, you can, because you've sort of established some solid ground to walk on with the person. And oftentimes when you bring up politics there, you're not trying to win a debate anymore. You're just kind of conversing with a fellow citizen and trying to make sense of the world and, the kind of community we want to live in.
It's true. And what you're really gaining there is a richer social experience, right? It gives you more insight into the world with different perspectives. And ultimately, what I think keeps people from adopting perspectives or points of view in the world is the thought that no one like myself could think that way, right? And it could be remarkably surprising to see someone who's very much like themselves in many respects could actually think in just the opposite fashion. And it gives you a fuller grasp on, it humanizes people, right? It shows there's far more to people than just the labels. And that's a really valuable lesson that we can learn. And one of the real valuable insights on offer uniquely through political dialogue. That's, I think, a good way of summing up what it means to win in political dialogue.
I think it's right, and you know victory where you've come away having learned something, and ideally even made a friend or and a good acquaintance who you want to talk to again. And part of it is just having that attitude of check the brakes at the assumptions. If someone says something surprising, you ask them to tell you more, and surprise them in turn. And if you really do follow that, you can kind of get around to talking about your politics. It's no longer threatening. It's just actually a learning opportunity.
Yeah, it's almost like you've pulled, it's like you've deactivated the grenade, right? It's no longer this combustible thing anymore. It feels a lot safer because there's a level of trust that's been established between the two discussants, right? And in future topics that we're going to explore, we're going to see perhaps in more specific scenarios, whether it be about gun control or about abortion or many other hot topics, as far as controversies or flashpoints in our political culture, what would it look like to apply these skills, apply these tactics in order to have more fruitful dialogues?
Yeah, some grenades are harder to diffuse than others,
Yes.
but talking about it is the one way forward.
Yeah, it's the only option.